In our next session, we're going to be talking about gender inequity in climate change. I want to welcome J.C. Weathers to the stage. Let's welcome J.C. Weathers. Our next presenter, she has a passion for sustainability. Welcome, J.C. Good to see you. She is marketing strategist and the community manager for Women in Climate Tech and an account executive at Bennycoms. We'd also like to welcome Nahali Anupriya to the stage. She has worked as an advisor for 3 presidents for the United Nations on climate change. Ladies, welcome. All right, thanks.
Thanks so much, Layla. Thank you. Nahali, I'm so glad you're joining me on stage today. As Layla mentioned, my name is J.C. Weathers, and I'm the community coordinator for Women in Climate Tech, and I'll be moderating today's panel. I'd like to start with a brief introduction to who Women in Climate Tech, who we are. We are an international group of professionals working on climate change in different industries, from corporations to nonprofits to academia and more. We are all really passionate about amplifying and empowering the voices of women and non-binary individuals as we fight together for a sustainable future. And so I'm guessing that a lot of you share the same sentiments that we do, and there are, of course, so many solutions to climate change, from carbon capture to solar power, but what we're here today to discuss is something that I think you'll find pretty surprising. One of the most effective solutions to climate change is actually gender equity. There's a lot of research to support this, and we'll cite a little bit of it, but the focus of today's discussion is how to harness this fact in our businesses and daily lives. So with that, I'd love to introduce you to our fantastic group of panelists. Joining me on stage, of course, is Nahali Anupriya from the UN. And then we've also got some folks joining us from Zoom. Here they are. Hi, everyone. We've got, yes. We have Emily Waisley from WSP joining us. We have Zlata Huddleston from IBM. And we also have Dr. Marcia Beliciano joining us from Relics. So with that, I would love to turn it over to our panelists to introduce themselves and say a few words about how they work on climate in their careers. So Nahali, I'll start with you.
Thanks, and thank you to the Nest Summit for having me and all of us here. So my name's Nahali Anupriya. As it's been mentioned already, I've worked with 3 presidents of the UN General Assembly on climate, oceans, small island states, and everything in between. A lot of this involves international negotiations on how we get to the future that we all want, prioritizing people and planet. So that's me.
Great, thank you. Emily, let's pass it over to you.
Thanks, JC, and it's so great to be here with the fellow Women in Climate Tech members. I'm Emily Waisley. I lead WSP USA's Corporate Climate Risk, Adaptation and Resilience Practice. WSP is a global engineering and professional services firm. I've been in this field for about 15 years. I've partnered with government entities, utilities, Fortune 50s to Fortune 500s to really institutionalize climate considerations into existing risk management, business continuity, and sustainability efforts.
Awesome. Really glad that you're able to join us. And let's go over to Zlata. I'd love to hear you say a few words.
JC, my name is Zlata Huddleston. I'm a partner at IBM Business Services based in Toronto, Canada. I work as a business transformation consultant with specific focus on financial institutions as my client base. And focusing on sustainable finance and climate risk management as my areas. Prior to joining IBM, I spent 30 years in corporate investment banking in US, Europe, and Canada, where I must admit I've lived the issues of gender equity or inequity every day, having to advocate for women in banking. I'm fascinated by implications of climate risk on financial industry and particularly on the intersection of gender equity and climate risk. And I'm very excited to be here today with all of you.
Great, great. Let's pass it over to Marcia.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be with you. I am participating from London, where RELX is headquartered. We are the world's knowledge company. We're about data that makes a difference across science, risk, and industries. We are passionate about the rule of law and access to justice through one of our businesses, LexisNexis Legal and Professional, and we also have very large events business. I've had the pleasure of being the founding head of ESG and corporate responsibility for my company, and have been at this for quite a while as we continue year on year to raise the bar in terms of our activities. And I would say that the intersection of climate and gender is such an important one that we all need to get to grips with. I think what I'm trying to focus on with the 33,000 people in our business is ensuring that we have our own house in order, setting science-based carbon reduction targets, meeting those, setting and making a net zero commitment through the climate pledge, also doing things like setting an internal carbon price, but we also need to be using our products and services to advocate for climate action. And I'll talk a little bit more about that as we get into the session, but it's an honor to participate, especially with such a great group of women doing such important work.
That's fantastic. As you can see, our panelists are really world-class, and I'm so honored to be sharing the stage with them today. I will give you a quick rundown of the way we're going to run our conversation. So first we'll have Nahali, and she'll set the stage for why gender equity matters and how it integrates with climate change. Next, we'll have Zlata speak about the nexus of gender equity and financial success. And then we'll pass it over to Emily, who will discuss how companies can think of gender equity as climate opportunity multiplier. And she'll also discuss some results that we have from a recent survey we did of our members. And finally, we'll have Marcia, who will highlight research into the science of climate change and where women are featured. So without further ado, let's get started. And I'd love to ask Nahali, can you fill us in on how gender and climate change are related?
Sure. So I'm not the first person to say this, and I won't be the last person to say this, I hope. We have less than a decade to make some seriously transformative changes across our societies, our businesses, our households, the way we think about each and every industry that we're all involved in. This involves investing in women and girls as 51% of the global population, and ensuring that they're part of the solution that we're going to put forward for the climate crisis. I'd love to explain a little bit why climate change as a challenge and gender equity as a challenge are linked in two ways, both in terms of how they contribute to worsening the two issues as a problem, but also how they contribute to both issues as sharing solutions and cross-populating that way. So some examples, I don't mean to bring the mood of the room down, but after the 2004 tsunami, 70% of all of the deaths that we saw after that were women and girls. 80% of the people who were still facing economic impacts and loss of livelihoods after Hurricane Katrina a year on were women. The women that stand to lose their jobs, livelihoods, or means of making an income, means of building sustenance for their own households. These are the women that are on the front lines when it comes to talking about the impacts of climate change. World over, the women that we see living in extreme poverty represent over 80% of the most impoverished households. And this leads to a whole multitude of multipliers. We're talking about poverty traps on an economic level. We're talking about lower food security, vulnerability to natural shocks like after a drought or after a hurricane. Really, the downward spiral doesn't stop, but we can turn that around. There's also an upward spiral. So what's the opportunity here? One of the examples, investing in women and girls' education, Project Drawdown has us at that being an 85 gigaton opportunity of reducing climate emissions. This is related to a whole bunch of things. More resilient practices when it comes to making economic decisions, better asset management. In very simple terms, you give women land, they tend to look after it a little bit better. And study after study has shown that. Forget about land, you give women financial assets, and they tend to give that back with a multiplier of over 7. So it just makes financial sense to be doing this. We've also seen that countries, sub-regional groups, sub-national groups that have a higher representation of women in governance systems, so on the boards of businesses, on the governance systems for local institutions like your city council, for every 1% increase in female representation on those groupings, we see a 5% increase in the amount of longevity-focused policies that those groups come up with. So it's really about investing in solving the issue now, but in a way that's going to ensure that we're able to keep on doing so and build upon the women who came before us. So that's kind of what I want to help do here.
Yeah, and I think that really sets the stage for the conversation we're continuing to have at Women in Climate Tech and for our conversation today. So thank you so much for providing that background. And so building on that, Zlata, I'd love to hear from you about how gender equity supports profitable business practices.
Thank you for this question, JC. I'd like to actually start with a little personal anecdote on gender equity. I have 3 sons, and they're huge fans of the TV show called Flash. Some of you might know it. It's the whole superhero culture. And they've been playing this game with me for years. And it goes like this. What's your superpower, Mom? And the response is, of course, you guessed it, I'm a woman. My superpower is I'm a girl. Seriously, though, the good place to start in answering the question is the fact that there is evidence that gender and racial equity is important for profitability. There are so many studies showing this. I just read an article that cited specific evidence proving that in the first half of 2021, 73% of companies were with verifiable gender equity practices showed increased profitability in the first half of financials. S&P also recently published a paper with full statistical backup on this notion. And also, according to the recent study published by International Monetary Fund, the benefits of closing the gender gap are not only larger than previously estimated, they can contribute to increasing a country's domestic product by as much as 35%. But this kind of evidence continuously highlighted in the media, both investors that provide corporate capital and regulators that have oversight functions are increasingly recognizing that gender equity is not just a matter of fairness to women, it's a matter of better business. And the notion is fully bought into by corporate world as well. Take the well-known 30% coalition, for example. They focused on board diversity in the US and are representing over $7 trillion in combined assets under management. They articulated the commitment of more than 400 organizations to continue to press for more board diversity across gender, race, and ethnicity. And it's going beyond boards. The New York State Department of Financial Services recently wrote a letter to all banks and financial services that they supervise, requiring them to disclose diversity data relating to their boards and senior leadership. And they stated unequivocally that they intend to get more granular with these requirements in the very near future. So we know that number one, gender equity makes companies more profitable. Number two, that regulators and investors are moving to ensure it. Number three, and you wouldn't be in this audience if you didn't already know that climate change threatens to destabilize financial markets with losses of tens of trillions of US dollars. And number 4, I'm actually going to let Emily expand on how gender equity is a climate solutions multiplier, making all climate work effective. With that, what I'm trying to do every day, both as part of Women in Climate Tech, as well as in my day job at IBM, is to bring all these concepts together in various ways and help financial services providers to ensure that their strategy in tackling climate change is successful. For example, integrating and embedding equity into responsible artificial intelligence solutions that IBM builds for our sustainable finance and climate risk management clients is important. And I also think that embedding gender and racial equity into climate-related reporting that already takes place in most large financial institutions around the world, in my view, is also essential. With that, I probably already took too much time to answer your question, JC. So back to you.
Yeah, well, I think you just hit on a lot of things that speaks to probably a lot of people here as well, where putting climate and even gender equity in financial terms is something that's a really effective way to get more people to listen. And so I think the insight that you provided is really helpful in illustrating that. So building on that, as Lada alluded to, we're going to turn to Emily. And Emily, I know you've worked with a lot of clients in your consulting work, and I'd love to know what the climate risks and opportunities are for these clients and how you can provide some sort of gender lens on top of that as well.
Sure, thanks, JC. So what are we seeing in this space now? Well, the notion of climate risk is really helping companies better understand and prepare for climate change. So what this means is that we need to be able to put a price on climate change so companies can embed this price into their books. I'll get down to a little bit of more as we get to the equity piece, but the first component is what are the climate risks that we're seeing? And how important is it to organizations that I've been working with and everyone else on this panel have been working with or are indeed in their own companies. So about 70% of our respondents in our recent survey stated that the issue of climate risk is extremely important to their organization's work. A growing number of country governments like France, the UK, Switzerland, and New Zealand, and some major investors like BlackRock, State Street, and Vanguard are all pushing companies and financial institutions to report their climate-related risks on a mandatory rather than a voluntary basis. So we do see an uptick in the number of businesses that are going through this process. And one framework that they have aligned to is the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. So while companies are starting to make this connection between climate-related risks and opportunities, they have yet to make that further connection to gender equity and the value that gender equity provides to their bottom line. So what are some risks that we're seeing? For those companies who are assessing their climate-related exposure, we're seeing that these climate-related risk assessments can oftentimes lead to divestment from already vulnerable or frontline communities, those that experience the physical impacts of climate change first and worst, and oftentimes cannot afford the rapid transition to a low-carbon future. When we think of the physical risks from climate change and extreme weather, an example of a recent divestment from a frontline community occurred after the aftermath of Hurricane Harvey. So when Hurricane Harvey hit Houston, a global financial technology company, its largest manufacturing campus was heavily flooded. In 2017, its global data center was inundated along with buildings where the tech company's servers and data storage gear were assembled. 2 months later, this company announced that it was moving all of their manufacturing operations out of Houston to locations less exposed to climate and extreme weather events, including its employees. So I'm sure a lot of thought went into this consideration and this decision, but was it based on foundational equitable principles? Was it an equitable decision? We want to make sure that divestment is not the only option discussed at the highest level and that women are in the room when these discussions are being made. When we think about the transition to low carbon or zero carbon future, An example of, in the context of gender equity, is companies feeling pressure to cut their scope 3 emissions. These are emissions from suppliers or others outside of their organizations. Right now, 80% of workers in the garment industry are female. This is not by chance, but the result of discriminatory practices from start to finish. So if you wholesale cut their jobs without retraining or retention, the question is, will you be contributing to furthering the injustice and inequity in the garment industry? Could this lead to an increase in carbon emissions through the supply chain? Conversely, how could companies really use this as an opportunity to retain and retrain workers for the new low carbon economy? So these are the types of questions that we're exploring through the Women in Climate Tech effort. What about opportunities? Well, they're really important. 81% of our respondents in our survey said that opportunities are important to the organization's climate work. If gender equity is a solutions multiplier, as research from Project Drawdown and others suggest, here are some areas that gender equity can open up opportunities. So having more women in leadership roles across organizations, data and research has identified a direct correlation between women entering into higher leadership positions and an increase in company climate activities. A couple of statistics from recent Forbes releases and McKinsey research are that when female leaders are embedded across the management level and in the board level, decision making is improved by 87%. Decisions are made 2 times faster with half the amount of meetings. 60% have better results that were achieved overall by the organization, and overall higher profits and long-term value was made for the company. So truly, in making sure that there is equitable distribution of females across companies in governance structures, managing climate risk and opportunities is so, so critical to accelerating the climate action that we need to have that Nahali mentioned initially. So bottom line, 1, climate change and gender equity are inextricably linked. 2, organizations currently assessing their climate-related financial risks and opportunities are not yet centralizing equity. Through the Women in Climate Tech effort, we have begun this process to identify those practical ways that organizations can really centralize gender equity into their governance, their strategy, their risk management and metrics and targets to equitably address climate change. But we need your help. So please join us to fully realize this and accelerate your climate action. Thanks, JC.
Emily, you touched on so many things that I think everyone here is really passionate about on stage, and I wish we had more time to continue to unpack, but I would love to hear from Marcia. I know you have a lot of experience in climate change research, and so I was wondering, could you walk us through some interesting ways women are featured in that research?
Yes, thank you, JC. I want to link our discussion to the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. They were adopted by every nation of the UN in 2015, and they're a to-do list, if you will, for the world. There's 17 interconnected goals, and 2 of them are particularly relevant to our conversation. There is SDG 13, which is climate action, and there's also SDG 7, which is affordable and clean energy. A few years back, after the launch of the SDGs, my colleagues launched a free resource for anyone listening, anyone in the world. It's called the RELX SDG Resource Center, where you can get up-to-the-minute news on the SDGs and lots of data and content from across RELX, but also from a number of key partners, primarily from within the UN system. But last year we did something called the Power of Data to Advance the SDGs. We wanted to see, what was happening in terms of the research that's needed to really drive forward the agenda. And we looked at about 4 million publications over a 5-year period, concluding in 2019. And we picked one of those later years, 2018, and applied a gender lens to that. And at the very bottom 3 of the publications that make a reference to gender were at 4% of the amount of publications that reference gender was SDG 13, climate action, And then at the very bottom was affordable and clean energy. Only 1% of those publications referenced gender in the discussion. But the UN has recognized the need to, quote, systemic mainstreaming of a gender perspective. But clearly that research is showing, and you can find that report on the RELX SDG Resource Center, there's more that needs to be done. And I want to talk about another really important finding. If you look across the whole spectrum of research and the output by low-income countries, because as we heard from my colleagues, women are on the forefront of the challenges represented by the SDGs and also in particular, climate change. So what is their share of the research? And it's a really paltry sum. It's less than 1%. And if you look at, in particular, climate research, to advance SDG 13, climate action, it's 0.4% of the publications come from low-income locations. So we know that women are going to be adversely challenged by the effects of climate change, particularly in less developed countries. So that is a next effort that we need to do, and we're trying to be part of the solution as well with some of the work that we do through Research Without Borders to help with the output of Indigenous research, but also special support for women researchers to help them have a share of voice and a seat at the table.
That's fantastic. I love hearing more about that work just because measuring the effects of climate change and taking inventory is a really important part of all of this. We can't manage what we don't measure, so I think that's a really important take-home as well. And so I would love to kind of ask all of our panelists the same question. I was wondering, so what is one thing companies can do today to put all of these insights into action? So we'll start with Nahali. What do you think about this?
Yeah, I think my big ask is don't be fazed if the linkage isn't immediately clear for whatever your industry is. So the point we're trying to make is that by having a more inclusive approach, these things can happen automatically, almost. I think the first step is like being intentional about including a diverse range of voices at the table. So yeah, that's step one. You don't need to be a conservation organization to prioritize climate change, and you don't need to be a gender forward organization to prioritize gender equity. It should just be something that everyone does.
Yeah, I agree. That's great to hear, thank you. Zlata, we'll pass it to you.
Yeah, my big ask would be as you prepare your climate-related financial disclosures, and you're looking at climate risk and looking at scenario analysis based on different climate outcomes, and calculating financed emissions as a corporation, think about social impact of the decisions, and specifically the impact on women and binary individuals, non-binary individuals, and people of color and other historically marginalized groups, and how the climate-related decisions as a result of all these calculations going to impact historically marginalized groups and women and non-binary individuals.
Great, great. Emily, how about you? What's one thing a company can do today to put your insights into action?
One thing that you can do is join the Women in Climate Tech group and be a test bed for us to test out the research and the data that we found and the measures and the tools that we're developing collectively. This has been a voluntary effort with lots of heart and energy from women across the world, but we need your help, and we would love to test out the framework that we're developing that really helps to better embed gender equity across your business function. So if you want to join us, just reach out to JC.
Absolutely. And Marcia, I'd love to hear from you.
Well, it's a good question, and I think it starts with companies making sure that they set and publicly state inclusion goals. This is something that we have just done this year, and making sure that we provide a seat at the table for women within our own organizations, but to advocate for women to take their place as well in the discussion around climate change. And if you look at something called the Green Climate Fund as an example, only 15% of the involvement is from women. So, we need to have women being part of the conversation about the change that needs to happen. And I just want to end what I have to say with a really fascinating citation from the UN Food and Agricultural Organization, which says that raising women's labor force participation to country-specific male levels, to give two examples, would raise GDP in the United States by 5%, and in a country like Egypt by 34%. That's also confirmed by a report from the International Monetary Fund. So this stuff really matters. We know women can change the world. They have, and hopefully will continue to do so.
Absolutely. That's a fantastic answer. And I just wanted to expand on something that Emily mentioned. So over the summer, we embarked on a 6-week research project with Women in Climate Tech. Everyone on stage and on Zoom today was a key player in this report, and it's a phase 1 of a multi-phase study that we're working on. And so, Nahali, I'd love to ask you, what's a key takeaway that you have from working on this project over the summer?
The opportunity is unbounded. So this just makes a lot of sense. With the TCFD and climate risk reporting, a lot of companies are making these changes in any case. It just doesn't make sense to reinvent the wheel and forget about doing it from a gender equity perspective until someone asks you to. So, yeah.
Absolutely. That's great to hear. And so I think we're going to wrap it up. Thank you so much to our panelists here. It was really great to hear from all of you and your different perspectives. And our group of, as I mentioned, our group of panelists have been instrumental in Women in Climate Tech's research project over the summer. A lot of the ideas, as referenced today, were unpacked further in our phase 1 report, and we're really, really excited to continue this work. Ultimately, we will be putting together a toolkit for businesses to use the gender equity lens on their climate risk reporting, and we want you to get involved. So if you are interested in anything we're saying today, something you can do is go to our website at womeninclimatetech.org, subscribe to our newsletter, and we will send you all of the updates and we'll keep you involved. And we really look forward to working together because, as we all know, climate change is a huge issue and it's going to take all of the help we can get. And so we're really looking forward to partnering with everyone. So thank you so much to the Nest Summit, and it's been a fantastic conversation. Thank you, everyone.